Welcome to the Women Leaders Association Daily Member Podcast, where we believe we go further, faster, and have more fun when we go together. I'm your host, Julianne Kirkland. And in each Daily Member Podcast, we will pick out a great speaker from one of our meetings that we thought you would enjoy. You can access hundreds of recent speakers, book summaries, great articles, and more at no additional charge through your membership portal. If you would like to get involved in a Women Leaders Association mastermind group or find a networking group near you, or if you just need access to the membership portal, simply go to womenleaderspodcast.com to be connected. Now let's tune in for this incredible message.
I am actually a strategist in the advertising world. I spent the last 20 years of my career working for full service agencies. I live in Chicago now with my 3 children who sometimes drive me crazy, but they're out with their grandparents this week for spring break, so that's nice. And I head up the strategy department. I've been doing that for the last 5 years at Ogilvy, which is a big advertising agency, and it's wonderful. We really get to dig into how people think. And we're often credited for the strategies you see behind all of the ads and communications out in the world. So this is something that is very near and dear to my heart in terms of cultivating a network of champions. And I'm excited to talk to you about the topic today. So with that, we can dive on in. As I've said, this is a topic that I'm extremely excited about, not only because it is so important, but also because it is so incredibly underdeveloped in the business world today. And I think we've seen a ton of buzz and articles surrounding kind of the new culture of companies and how, companies are really trying to make a shift in how they show up for their employees and people. But the reality is, to really do it and do it well, it takes a ton of time and a ton of commitment. And look, I think the interesting thing is that almost all organizations can agree that, a good culture that's going to cultivate a team of champions, is going to look something like one that fosters collaboration and humility, growth, safe spaces, all of these things. But the difference is agreeing on what that looks like is the easy part. Where a lot of companies fall short is that they get stuck in the how. How do you cultivate it? How do you do that? So we're going to talk about that today. And on the next slide, that's the key word. All right. This is the focus word, right? Cultivate. And what was interesting is that it actually is the Latin root that the word culture stems from, right? Not surprisingly. So when we consider the word culture as it was originally meant, this verb, it's really about what matters, and it's the actions and behaviors that are going to demonstrate how we cultivate that in a very intentional and very deliberate way. And for me, cultivating a team of champions, again, takes that time and commitment, but it requires active participation and active daily participation. It requires incredibly strong communication, probably over communicating. It requires an emotional bond. To do it right, you got to really, feel something, and it has to really be something that's palpable to the person and yourself. And then it certainly requires that shared vision, right? So this is all about, this word cultivate and the action put behind it. And it is something that requires good leaders to actively, daily, sincerely commit to doing it. Quote one of the best leadership motivational speakers and quote Mr. Sinek, right? It's a powerful quote. The real job of a leader isn't about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in our charge. And I remember seeing this years ago, and it really struck me. And it's something that I remind myself of every single day because it's a huge, huge responsibility. And it's something that, really speaks to the fact that great leaders aren't responsible for the job. They are responsible for the people who are responsible for the job. And that does mean that when things go right, you give them all the credit. And it means when things go wrong, you probably take on quite a bit of that burden. But that's the job. And that's what it means to be a good leader. And that's certainly what it means to cultivate the champions that you're caring for, that are in your charge. If you think about that quote and you think about how you can really reframe the way you think about your job, so often, without any malintent at all, and I'm certainly guilty of this, we ask ourselves, how do I get the best out of my people? And it's a question we hear all the time. But if you really want to cultivate people, you have to start rewording and reframing that question to be what we see over here. How do I help my people be at their best? And not just at their best, but really like at their natural and truest best, right? That's going to be a much, much better outcome when you think about that in terms of how you're leading and cultivating this team that you're working with. And I think it's very different because typically managers are, management is about day-to-day operations. It's about getting things done. But leadership, completely flipping the coin over, is about the people. So I guess the question then back to this, how do I help my people be at their best? I want to start to dig into that and unpack it. And, I'm a big tennis fan. There's a simple equation that, Tim Galloway, he was an amazing tennis coach. He wrote The Inner Game, Games of Tennis, and he came up with this great equation. It's very simple. He talks about, performance equates to potential, subtract the interference. And the unfortunate reality is that most leaders tend to focus on improving performance, right? We focus on, how do we get to that performance optimization, not how do we eliminate the interference. But Tim does something interesting, and he flips this default method that we typically have on its head. And he starts to think about, instead of focusing on the addition and bringing, performance up that way, let's start to think about how we can actually subtract some of those interferences that get in the way and that can perhaps degrade what is already inherent in the gifts that we were given and some of our greatness. So that's what I'm going to talk about for the next couple slides, because interferences, if you go to the next slide, can really come in a lot of different forms, right? You've got things that are those mental blocks. You've got things like fear, self-doubt. Then you might have things that we've all been guilty of, which is complacency. It's good enough. I'm tired. It's fine. And then you have interference, perhaps on the other end of the spectrum, in the egotism route. I know what I'm doing. I've got this, right? So how do we eliminate some of those? How do we start to think about subtracting rather than adding? And one of the other biggest culprits that we see on the next slide, and you can continue to click forward, and you can keep going again, is this notion of lack of clarity. And it's so incredibly important as leaders who are cultivating your team to make sure you get it. I often see this with clients that I'm working with. I go into an organization and I pass out pieces of paper and I ask them all to tell me what's your purpose? What's your reason for being? And I collect all the pieces of paper and I read them out. And what happens is typically every single piece of paper says something different. And it's because people are usually only pretty clear, right? And that's a huge difference in being really clear. Lack of clarity, if you don't have clarity of purpose, that is, the one consistent, predictable factor in how people do their jobs, then people are just sort of clear and they're going to experience confusion. They're going to experience stress. They're probably going to experience frustration. They're going to waste time, energy on a lot of different trivial things. But when there's this high level of clarity, on the other hand, people thrive. They become champions, and you're cultivating those champions. So this is really simple. Think about how we can do this from I'm pretty clear on the next slide to just getting to being crystal clear and really understanding the impact that can have. Because if we move forward one more slide, the reality is without your own clarity of purpose as a leader and without having that, with sharing that with others, you really can't have clarity with people. You can't cultivate people in the way that they need to understand what they're working towards and how you should work with each of them. So I want to spend the next few slides going through a few different ways that you can cultivate your teams every single day I'm sure many of you have heard some of these, but I think they sometimes tend to seem like soft skills that maybe just kind of can fall away. So it's always great to have reminders. But let's go through 5 different ways, and we'll start with the first one on the next slide. Embrace their authentic selves. And this is twofold, right? This is, first of all, you need to also, as a leader, embrace your authentic self. You need to be vulnerable. You need to make sure you're creating that safe work environment for employees and encouraging them to be themselves. But you also want to make sure that you're not making mini yous. The world doesn't need a bunch more of just Pipers everywhere. That's the beauty of cultivating this team of champions, is that you want to actually embrace all of the uniqueness and all of the different skill sets, personalities, diversity of thinking, in order to kind of, have optimal results and really have a team that is reinforced in terms of who they are and embracing who they are at their core. And I love this quote that Oprah talks about, because it's so real and it's so her. She says, "If I had no idea that being my authentic self could make me as rich as I've become. If I had, I would have done it a heck of a lot earlier." And I don't blame her. But she is who she is, and she certainly has been embraced for it. The second one, I'm sure we've all heard this, but it's a great reminder to practice empathy. And having empathy, by the way, is not the same thing as demonstrating empathy. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion falls, is as leaders, so often we say, no, I'm a pretty empathic person. I think I get that. But if you're not demonstrating it, then it doesn't really matter. And empathy is very different from sympathy. Sure, you can feel bad for somebody else who's experiencing something perhaps difficult or in a situation that you can sympathize with. But empathy allows you to go deeper, to truly understand what another person is going through, so you can connect with them, right? You can connect with them on that deeper level. You're creating that emotional bond we talked about earlier. And the science right here really tells us that empathy and leadership go hand in hand. So we know that employees want more of it, but unfortunately, it's incredibly undervalued in their minds. We know that as it relates to leaders, there's about 60% of them that simply don't have strong enough empathy skills. But then we also know from a success standpoint, in terms of the business and the environments that in organizations that we're working in, we know there's a strong correlation between companies who have high empathy scores and their earnings and their success. So there's a lot more work to do here. And there's a quote that I love. Theodore Roosevelt talks about, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And, empathy is one of those things where you have to really practice it first. You have to really understand and put yourself in the shoes of the other person before you can, really put yourself into that situation in terms of sharing what you know. So really think about empathy in a bigger way and make it a daily practice. The third area is all about boundaries. And this is not just on the work front, by the way, this is at a personal level too. Again, we've heard lots about this, since COVID and beyond, but, respecting and understanding what boundaries mean is incredibly important. This notion of the power of no, no is a very small word, but it packs a pretty big punch. And it carries in some ways this invisible force that can feel like a dirty word. We've almost kind of deemed it such. We're taught that kind of saying no might be a negative thing. But I think that pendulum is swinging over here a little bit more. And we're starting to see that actually saying no can be incredibly important because it's not just about you saying no for yourself. It also can help the other team if you're saying no because it doesn't align with your ability or your schedule or your beliefs or your priority. Or because if you have too many things going on, saying yes to everything, essentially is saying no to a lot of other things. So understanding that. And, I think there's a lot of fear around people saying this word, and it is something that has to be learned. So how, as a leader, can you cultivate when and how and the safety of using this word, and when you're thinking about your job, your teams, and so on? The next one, mental health matters. You can go back. Thanks. This one is also one that we've heard a lot about. Mental health is on everybody's radar, and certainly companies are paying a lot more attention to it. But sleep is one of those things. Encourage your teams to get the rest, to unplug. It's super important. This notion of sleep is for suckers is long gone, and now sleep is really a true status symbol that the most successful people on the planet practice at least 7+ hours of every night. So those are examples of mental health and really unplugging. And then this notion of a source for liberation. I think boundaries naturally are going to generate safety in relationships. And when your boundaries are respected, you're actually more likely to feel heard and validated and appreciated. And that's a really liberating feeling. Whereas before, it used to be more debilitating, like, oh, I'm going to get fired if I say no. Oh, I'm not going to be respected. We've seen that shift. So it's a really nice one. So respect and understanding those boundaries is key. And the next one, you got a sneak peek, but we'll go back to it. Number 4, which is don't delegate, empower. So going back to the point I made earlier about clarity for a moment, the key to empowerment is clarity, essentially, because once you have that absolute clarity and everyone on the team is really clear about what they are expected to contribute, what everyone else is contributing, you no longer have to delegate, right? Because empowering essentially transfers that belief in ownership. And it says to your team, I trust you. I know that this is going to work out. And, a nice way of thinking about this in the form of a question is, instead of simply delegating, a team member to start ordering supplies, what if you empower them to improve the entire supply buying process? What might that look like? So this notion of, unexpected possibilities and where that can transcend is really magical. So I urge you to not just give them a task, but give them a challenge, because when leaders tend to delegate, it's really about them. It's about them getting their task done. But when leaders empower, it's about others. It's about really reinforcing these things like learning and trust and the other centricity that's on that top piece. So really important. And then this fifth area is one that, on the next slide, I wish I didn't have to put on here. Because I think it's one of those things that we're all hopefully well-mannered individuals and say our thank yous and appreciate that. But the reality is, don't assume that your employees and coworkers really know how much you appreciate their contributions, their strong work ethic, their support on a project. You really need to communicate these feelings with gratitude, and it really shouldn't just feel like a generic rhetorical kind of response. Gratitude has such power to transform, so much. It can turn a routine job into joy for people. It can change an ordinary opportunity into something incredibly powerful. And you can see that, unfortunately, it's one of the biggest reasons why people end up leaving their jobs, is because they don't feel appreciated. And then affirmation is another thing that is so underutilized in terms of leaders really affirming the superpowers of their team. And why I say this is because so often some people don't even realize what is their superpower. So if you're not acknowledging it and you're not affirming it to them, they're not going to elevate it. They're not going to lean into it. They're not going to perhaps even, pay much attention to it at all. So really thinking about these 2 A's in tandem and making sure that if you think you're doing a good enough job at it, it never hurts to remind someone one more time a day how much you appreciate them and affirm the strengths that you see them living, they're in their job and in their own life. It's a very, very rewarding and simple way to cultivate your team. And then I thought I'd close out, in the spirit of basketball, March Madness coming to an end and all that, on the next slide with just a nice quote. And I realize he was in college, but you get it. I love this quote. I think it's so important. I've shared a lot of things that can be applied at that individual or team level. But I think it's really important to not forget that when you are cultivating this team of champions, you understand that dynamic of a team in terms of it's made up of individuals, and each individual, is made stronger because they have the team. So this notion of working together cohesively towards a common goal, using those different skill sets and knowledge to enhance the performance is going to produce a great outcome every single time. So the strength of the team is each individual member. The strength of each member is the team. And don't you forget it. So that is what I have for you today. I am happy to answer any and all questions, but I hope that was inspiring. And I hope many of you are already doing all of these things. But if not, make sure you start and superpower some of them, if so.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And yes, just as a reminder, if anyone would like to ask a live question, you can raise your hand and I can see you and I can unmute you so you can ask a live question. And I'm going to start with this question from Bethany that came in. Bethany said, I have a few new team members. How can I get to know them without crossing the line, keeping good boundaries? Are there any good questions to ask in a one-on-one?
That's a great question. I love that question. Well, first of all, I also think it's a great question because I'm an extreme extrovert, and it's very easy for me to want to talk about different things and engage with people, but not everyone is like that. And I do think figuring out kind of the ways that you lean into the types of questions you ask them is an important one. I think you can do it if you want to make sure they feel comfortable. Sometimes you can say, hey, everybody kind of fills out the same template and we ask, favorite food, what was your favorite movie, things like that. You can have those icebreaker type questions. And I think you build from there. I think you really spend the time getting to know the person. What do you want to get out of this new position? How can I help you? Making sure your questions all go back to them feeling like you're a trusted leader that is thinking about them. If you start asking questions right away, hey, there's a project that just came on my desk, and I think your skill set would be really nice for it. What do you think? It's going to probably feel a bit more self-serving to you. So I would say with new relationships and getting to know people, make sure that they understand the dynamic of your sincerity in terms of really making it about them, because that's going to cultivate kind of the respect and trust that you earn right off the bat. I mean, it's very important to remember trust and respect are not given, they are earned. So asking yourself, how can I best do that with your line of questioning, I think is very key. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, we've had a couple of questions that have come in about empathy. I'm going to read this one from Anya. And Anya says, I'm way too sympathetic. I hope I'm empathetic, but how can I not be a pushover? Sometimes I need to say no.
Yeah, you sure do. So remember that. Yeah, I mean, look, if you look at the scale, there's sympathy, empathy, and frankly, then there's even compassion. I like to think of compassion as empathy in action. But I do think there's a very big difference between understanding, which is what empathy is all about, and being a pushover. And a lot of times you might have to, it's perspective training. It's kind of, I'm going to really take the time to understand from their perspective what they're feeling, what they're thinking, how they're kind of, approaching this situation. And then if you disagree, or if you have a different perspective, it doesn't mean that you just have to say, that's it. But I do think you have to take the time to put your opinions and your personal perspective aside and make sure you understand theirs. And if you don't understand it, you have to continue to challenge yourself and say, what am I missing about why I can't understand this? And chances are it's because you might not personally agree with it, but that doesn't mean there can be two truths at the same time. You don't have to agree with everybody's feelings, but you also can understand them. So I think it's really figuring out that balance. And I would also say, don't worry about you seeming like a pushover. Practice empathy because all you're thinking about is the other person. So it's not about you at all. It's not about what you think, what you look like or how they view you. It's really about empathizing with that person 110%. Hope that makes sense.
Yes. Well, we have one more question that came in kind of on the same topic. I'm just going to ask it again. And this question from Michelle says, I like to think I'm empathetic, but it's not my strong point. Is it possible to work on being more empathetic without coming across as a non-authentic person?
Absolutely. We get this question all the time. I think it's part of the authenticity piece, which is why those two are so important. And I think you can also own it and name it. I think part of being a vulnerable leader or peer is saying, listen, I'm not great at this, but I want to understand your perspective. I want to understand what you're going through, so I can help, or so, I can really give you advice. And I think you just own it. And I think you have to be vulnerable in that moment. And I think empathy used to be seen as a soft skill, and you either have it or you don't. But the beauty of today's kind of leaders is you don't practice a fixed mindset, meaning, you aren't just who you were when you were born. You actually have a growth mindset, and empathy is part of that. So if you don't have all the practice for how to do it right, you can continue to learn that. But I don't think that you ever have to do it the same way as somebody else. It all comes down to understanding. And part of how you understand somebody might be saying, listen, I'm not as good at just putting myself in somebody else's shoes right off the bat. I want you to explain to me the situation again. I really, really, really want to understand what you're feeling and see how I can help.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Well, before we move on to our panel discussion, do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom for all of our viewers today?
Oh my goodness. You didn't tell me you were gonna ask me that. No, I would just say just being here obviously is a testament to your commitment to wanting to be a great leader and a great steward for your teams. So continue to take these courses. Again, some of this stuff seems like low-hanging fruit. We should know it, but the reality is a lot of us don't practice it as much as we can. And that's it. It's practice. It's not something that you learn once and say, oh, I'm done. It's not a 2 + 2 = 4 scenario. It's something you yourself have to cultivate, have to nurture. So, kudos to all of you for being here and continuing to have these sessions.
Hey, my friend, if you enjoyed listening to this podcast, be sure to rate, review, and share your biggest takeaway. And if you're wanting more, you can access hundreds of recent speakers, book summaries, great articles, and more at no additional charge through your membership portal. You can also get involved in a Women Leaders Association mastermind group or a networking group near you. Or if you just need to access your membership portal, simply go to womenleaderspodcast.com to be connected. Because here at Women Leaders Association, we believe we go further, faster, and have more fun when we go together. That's all for today, my friends. Bye for now.